and welcome to Global South Rising. I'm Ileana Chan with my co-host here, Sara Vivacqua. Every week on Global South Rising, we break down the weekly news from around the world through an anti-imperialist lens. Friday, 9 a.m. BRT, 1 p.m. London, and 8 p.m. It might actually be 7 p.m., 8 p.m. Beijing time. We dismantle imperial narratives with analysis, opinion, and in-depth discussion on the challenges, achievements, and contradictions of building a new multilateral world. So today, though, we have a very special guest, a reoccurring, I was going to say old face, but a friend of show, an old friend of show. But I don't mean his age, but I just mean he's an old friend of our show. Our first ever guest, actually, like Sarah, you reminded me of that this week, Carlos Martinez. Carlos Martinez is a researcher, author, and political activist from the UK. His latest book is The East is Still Red. It's somewhere here in my room, but I can't get to it. And he is a co-founder and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China and co-founder of No Cold War. Yeah, and Sarah's bringing it up. Thank you, Sarah. Welcome back to the show, Carlos.
Thanks, Ileana. Thanks, Sarah. Great to be with you again.
And hello, Sara.
Hi, everyone. I'm having technical issues. I hope you can listen to me. I'm going to put my mic on so I don't need to shout around. Happy Workers' Day. Happy May 1st. And I want to show you, for everyone, my T-shirt. I stand with Iran. We should all buy this T-shirt. Yeah. Got it as a present.
On Workers' Day, Sarah is asking us to become more consumers.
Great.
But yes, I appreciate the spirit of what you're saying. So thank you. Today, though, we have a lot of really fun stuff that we're covering. Actually, good stuff, positive news this week, shockingly. But here we have the Meta being blocked in China, which we're going to discuss with Carlos. China's zero carbon emission coal, which is absolutely amazing for our planet. So we're going to get into that. Then we're going to get into an Iran update, not as positive. And then MI5 in Brazil, which I'm very curious about. That will be Sarah's watch. And then I will be doing a forced labor China debunking. I am tentatively calling my watch Le Boubou Forced La Labor. It's quite a ridiculous story, but it's important to debunk because no one ever looks at it, right? Looks at the initial allegations. But first up, we have Carlos. So welcome. And take it away, Sarah. Sarah, you're muted.
maybe myself. So, Carlos, what we saw this week was absolutely breaking news. We saw this AI intelligence developed in Chinese soil with Chinese scientists and Chinese government subsidize, trying to basically make a offshore washing, integrating themselves into Singapore, incorporate them in Singapore, so that probably for the purpose of global expansion and democratization of AI intelligence, and Meta wanted to buy it. And it's very interesting how the media has covered this. Looking into Reuters, into you name it, BBC, it was all over the news that China indicating, suggesting, and sometimes even explicitly saying that China was blocking, canceling 2 billion transactions. This is against the free market. This is against AI for all. China indicating that China was doing an arbitrary decision by blocking the purchase, the acquisition from Meta of Manus. So my first question to you is, what is Manus? Why Manus is so important? And what was actually this blocked about?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Manus is interesting because this whole field of AI, which has really been blowing up in the last few years, especially since OpenAI launched ChatGPT to the public a few years ago. It's currently, the trend is towards what people are calling agentic AI. So you don't just enter some text into a chat box and get some response back, but you actually give this kind of autonomous AI agent control of more or less your whole computer. It can log into your browser. It can use all your logins to different services. It can authenticate against different services, and it can execute complex tasks with multiple steps. And Manus was really the trailblazer in this. Manus was the first of these big agentic AI products, and it was built by Chinese engineers in China with support from the Chinese state. So in terms of why China would block this kind of deal, this $2 billion deal by Meta, well, I think there's a few reasons, and Sara, you've written about this, but and people should read that article. But I think first thing is China wants to and has a right to protect its own indigenous technical innovations. Okay, the Manus has registered itself in Singapore, but the fact is that Manus was built in China. Its development was subsidized by the Chinese government. All of the early research and development was conducted in China. The core data that it's based on comes from China. It's Chinese data. So, it's this technology and its personnel is very much tied to China's interests. And Manus has been a beneficiary of Chinese planning and Chinese regulation, right? And of the allocation of resources as determined by government's priorities in 5-year plans that are developed democratically by the Chinese people. The Chinese state has dedicated resources to the development of this technology, and China expects to be the beneficiary of that, not unreasonably, I think. The second thing is that China wants to protect itself from the US military-industrial complex and the security state. And as you've written about quite extensively, Sara, in your article, Meta operates essentially as an intelligence arm of the US state. It provides technology services. It provides artificial intelligence services for the military, for the CIA, for the FBI, for NATO, for the Five Eyes intelligence cooperation network between the US, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So, Meta's involved, as are Palantir, as are Google, as are numerous other massive US technology companies. They're involved in this war in Iran right now. There's a criminal aggression against Iran being carried out by the US and Israel, which we're going to talk about in more detail later in the show. All of these technologies are involved in this. So they're not just some kind of neutral bodies. They're just involved in computer software and all the rest of it. They're deeply integrated into the US security state, into the military-industrial complex, which means they're deeply integrated into the overall long-term strategy of US imperialism to contain, encircle, suppress, and ultimately break up and wage war against the People's Republic of China. So, of course, China would like to keep some distance from companies like Meta. And the last big factor is, I think, China wants to protect its digital sovereignty. This fits into a broader context that we're seeing globally around the importance of digital sovereignty, around the importance of independence in the technological sphere, as in the political sphere, as in the economic sphere, as in the military sphere, and to protect Chinese citizens and Chinese systems from foreign control and from foreign interference. And the US, I think, is deeply upset that China is actually, along with maybe Iran, maybe Russia, China is one of the very few countries outside the imperialist bloc that have actually achieved digital sovereignty, because the opposite of digital sovereignty, which is digital colonialism, digital imperialism, that is supposed to be that's one of the main strategic planks for projecting the US and the West's power from the 20th century into the 21st century. The US is not a manufacturing powerhouse anymore. The power of the dollar is declining. So US monopoly, like digital monopolies, are very important for maintaining US and Western hegemony in the 21st century. So China has up to now been doing an extremely good job of protecting itself against that, and it has no plans to stop protecting itself against that and asserting its sovereignty. And I think this Meta-Manus dynamic fits into that as well.
Why do you think this decision against Meta? So this decision, can you explain to us a little bit? Like the Chinese, they have the National Development and Reform Commission as part of this decision. Can you explain to us what is this entity actually, and how does it protect sovereignty? And what is the importance of the decision to say, hello, you are under Chinese jurisdiction? So can you unpack that for us, please?
Well, I mean, the legal side of it, you would understand better yourself, and maybe you can explain to us. But like this is just a regulatory body. All countries have regulatory bodies, right? And the hypocrisy is quite extreme in this case. You know, the US media and the Western media in general is going mental about this Chinese decision to block Meta's acquisition of Manus. But, you know, what would they do if one of the most promising, one of the most innovative AI startups in Silicon Valley was going to be acquired by Huawei or by Alibaba? Do you think that would pass with no problems whatsoever? You know, I live in a country, Britain, where Huawei has literally, at the mandate and behest of the United States State Department, Huawei has been blocked from our telecommunications infrastructure, has been blocked from 5G, which would help to explain why my internet connection is significantly worse than it was when I was in China last week. So, you know, we reserve the right in Britain to regulate on that basis, on security grounds, on digital sovereignty grounds, etc., etc. Actually, it's far worse in Britain's case because we're just doing what Washington tells us to do. Look at the Biden administration's actions against TikTok and the efforts to close down TikTok or to force its sale to a US-based larger institution, or the fact that Biden issued an executive order barring US investments in certain Chinese technologies, right? The US, the Britain, the European Union, Japan, they all operate these types of comparable review mechanisms. The difference is that when China uses them, it's treated as, you know, evidence of some kind of authoritarianism rather than a perfectly ordinary regulatory measure.
Yeah, can you expand on that, Sarah? Because you did write this article for the Global Times, and you write here, China has the right to intervene in this acquisition in accordance with laws and regulations. And I think this is something that is very rarely reported on when it comes to China's actions. Can you explain how China has done this in accordance with international law and its own law a little bit more, expand it a little bit more, and maybe sort of thread it through to how China usually acts? It's very consistent with the way that China usually acts, right?
Well, I don't think I know a great deal about that. It's just more of a, let's say, superficial investigation. So what I could tell is that Chinese had an extraordinary, super interesting way of protecting their AI digital sovereignty. They are a step ahead, I think. They have a legal basis which is fragmented. It's not one legislation, several legislation. And the most important piece that begins is the foreign investment law. Every country has this. The US applies this to everything. Well, the US is, let's remember, is sanctioning the whole world, is imposing tariffs in the whole world, and come to complain about this. So it begins with their foreign law investment. They have a list, the pre-establishment national treatment and the negative list, things that foreign investment need to have an authorization. This list has been expanded according to Global Times. And of course, it's not a business transaction to sell your AI, your technology sovereignty, when this world is all about this. This is the new war. We have wars waged through AI. Palantir it came out that the MENAP schoolgirls were a product of AI decisions. They come so fast that the general cannot even follow it, or the general sitting there cannot even know what control the AI chain of thought. So we have AI waging wars, killing people, torturing people, spying on people, and then we should give it to Meta, as Carlos put it, Meta. Do you remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal where they get 80 million profiling people to interfere in elections in dozens of countries? Yeah, even in Brexit. We had Stephen Bannon using Meta selling, like illegally selling this data to people, and elect Trump, elect Jair Bolsonaro. They waged campaigns and campaigns, and Sarah, it's a conspiracy theory. No, it's not a conspiracy theory. This is massively documented how Meta did this. Channel 4 had this this 3-part or 2-part documentary showing, and they said what we did in Mexico, what we did in Malaysia, we're now moving to Brazil, Australia, and China. That's Bannon saying that they want clear interfere in elections. So, but not only that, as Carlos was explaining, is completely integrated in the military complex, and I would say also ideological. I don't think it's just any strategic commercial alliance between Meta. I think Meta is ideologically very close to Zionism, very, very close to war, and they're killing people. And that's, I think, we need to throw here a question. Look, if I have a government who has a military and I start outsourcing things, outsourcing technology, let's say the Trump wall. The Trump wall was built with Microsoft Intelligence, the virtual wall. He was talking about the physical wall for his clock, for the people to applaud him, to create a fantasy around him. But the real wall he was building, and also Joe Biden was building, and Obama was building, was with Microsoft technology. So when you starting to have a privatization of mass surveillance and war aggressions, shouldn't these companies be held directly accountable for human rights violations? We should start thinking about that. We should start throwing this idea about that. State, I'm going to evade. Oh no, corporation and corporate and has co-opted the state anyway. So, let's just outsource thing and nobody responds, because human rights is between state and the citizens. It's a direct relationship between them. I am as a citizen and can, in principle, only claim that my human right was violated somehow through any state action. But if the state is outsourcing lethal force, we should be talking about any law. There is a doctrine for us, is the law of horizontal effect of human rights, direct or indirect effect. And I think we should start throwing that out there. And we should be asking those questions. I think Zuckerberg should be sitting not on let's the committee bank of parliamentary procedure. No, he should be sitting in The Hague. The Palantir should be sitting in The Hague. Yeah. Thank you.
I do have a question about this, though. I don't know if either of you have researched into this, or is this a historical first in this way? Because, I mean, obviously, a lot of companies have their early R&D, research and development, in China, and then they might be acquisitioned outwards, right? But do you think this is a specifically historical, is there a precedence for blocking acquisitions? Do you have any idea about that?
I think Carlos can explain this better, but what I can say, it's a first from legal terms, is that China is through this decision saying, hello, dear, it's not because you just formally incorporate offshore that you are out of our jurisdiction. In this sense, it's a novelty.
Interesting.
We saw the trick, but I think in the historical, I think Carlos will know. I don't.
I haven't got the data to hand, but I think you could consider it as being pretty similar to what the US is trying to do in relation to TikTok and trying to separate TikTok from its from ByteDance, which is actually coincidentally also registered in Singapore.
Right.
That is, a Chinese or Chinese origin company. So the first, it was actually started by the first Trump administration and then continued and escalated by the Biden administration, the attempt to either just completely kill off TikTok in the US or to force it to change ownership to an American company. So I think you can see that as being similar, albeit not exactly.
But I suppose, I mean, in that case, it was successfully transferred to Larry Ellison, right? Which is Oracle. But this case, no. So I wonder if this is going to set a new precedent that there are more safeguards for R&D, especially in this sensitive area for Chinese companies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're also talking about very new technology. The whole world is kind of trying to figure out what to do about AI. The whole world is wondering, or should be wondering, frankly, what AI governance looks like. The UN is behind in figuring out how to regulate this at a global level. The US approach is very laissez-faire. They're just like, let's let these huge tech monopolies do whatever they want, and we'll see what happens. We're not going to interfere. And this comes back down to ultimately the difference between the US and Chinese economic models, meaning that it comes down to the difference between a fundamentally capitalist and a fundamentally socialist economic model, which is that one of those systems prioritizes profit, the expansion of capital at all costs, and the other prioritizes the production of use values and the improvement of human life at all costs. In a framework of trying to protect human beings and the planet, then of course you need to regulate AI. Of course you need to not prioritize private profit. Of course you need to think about what the effects of this technology are going to be, like giving access to everything that your computer can do with your input to an algorithm, that it can log into your online banking, that it can log into your your tax accounts and things like that. You're basically giving it access to your entire digital life, which increasingly is like our entire life in the 21st century, right? So I think regulation is going to take a while to catch up with reality, but the Chinese approach, as with many other things, is far more responsible, far more measured, far more sensible than that of laissez-faire capitalism, which just says let's let massive tech corporations do whatever they want to do, and we'll deal with the consequences later.
Yeah, and I just want to remind people that China actually does have a global AI governance action plan, just in case. I'm going to put this link down in the description as well, just in case you want to read through what could, because a lot of people are like, well, let's not use AI. But I mean, there is a way to use AI that might actually be beneficial to all of us. And China's kind of putting this very simple plan, out, proposing this plan out. So it's worth a read, at least. Go ahead, Sarah. But yeah, it's a very interesting news item. Thank you so much for bringing it to us and for writing that, Sarah, and for the surrounding expansion on the themes. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Thanks to Socialist China for publishing it.
Yeah, I put the link in the chat box as well, so you guys can read the Socialist China article. It's really good. But I guess moving on then, if you have nothing else to add. Okay, so the other interesting news item coming out of China this week, is the zero carbon emission coal-based battery. I am very curious about this because, I'm going to try to, you actually tweeted about it. So let's see if I can figure out how to do that. You tweeted about it, Carlos. But essentially, Western media often accuses China of using too much coal because its total coal consumption is the largest in the world, the world's largest. I mean, also their population is really big. So just like, let's try to put that in perspective there. Even though the coal share of its energy mix has been steadily declining, while the country simultaneously leads global growth in renewable energy. But now Chinese scientists have developed a zero-emission coal-based electricity technology. Carlos, can you explain what this new innovation is and the significance of it? And also, is there a time frame for rollout into wider use? What do you think? Where are we? I guess, in this?
Sure. I mean, first thing to say is that moving away from burning coal as a primary source of energy is hugely important for the survival of humanity and the planet, because coal is the world's dirtiest energy source in terms of the amount of carbon emissions per unit of actual useful energy. And China is, there's no getting away from it. China is the world's largest consumer of coal. China is the world's largest producer of coal and has been for many decades. And in many ways, you could argue that China's rise has really been fueled by coal. If it weren't for the fact that China has vast quantities of coal available to it, that can be extracted very cheaply, then China's rise wouldn't have happened at the pace that it has, and we wouldn't see the China that we see today. So, coal has played a very important role in China's emergence as a sort of economic superpower. But as you mentioned in your question, in your introduction, China's been working very hard to reduce its reliance on coal. Coal occupied something like 80% of China's energy mix just 25 years ago, and it's now under 50%, and it's declining very fast. China is, as people will already know, China is by far the world leader in every type of renewable energy. It installs more renewable capacity annually than the rest of the world does combined. And yes, China is, a criticism you often hear is, well, China's doing all this with renewable energy, but it's also building new coal power stations. And it's true, China is building some new coal power stations, but these are like backup reserve capacity alongside solar photovoltaic and wind power stations, because those sources are intermittent. So when it's nighttime or when there's not much wind, then they can fail over to coal, essentially. So actually, and kind of ironically, and in a way that seems contradictory, the construction of new coal power stations indicates massive progress being made in renewables development. But as to this particular story that you've highlighted, as I've commented in the post, that so Chinese scientists have developed a zero carbon emission coal-based battery, right? So we can read it there. Coal is pulverized, dried, purified, and oxidized, and it yields electricity without a steam cycle, without a mechanical turbine. So unlike the way fossil fuel-based electricity generation works at the moment, basically you burn some coal, you burn some oil, you burn some natural gas, you heat up some water, that drives a turbine, and that generates electricity. So that's basically the internal combustion engine. So this is completely separate technology, completely different use of coal.
Can you explain to us, Carlos, you're a science of man. Can you explain to us a little bit how this technology works for a lay person?
Yeah, I'm not that scientific. Some form of chemical process in this process, like in this purification and oxidization of coal, will yield electricity. I haven't even looked into the lower level mechanics of that. I'm sorry. But it's completely separate to like the combustion engine model of use of fossil fuels. As it stands, this is very, very small scale. It's very experimental, right? And I think it does have the potential to be scaled up. It could be useful as a transitional technology, especially countries that heavily dependent on coal. But one, I don't think it will be kind of ready for serious industrial level use for at least another 10 to 15 years. Like it's very much at the experimental phase at the moment and the research phase. Two, I don't think it's going to be the kind of game changer. I think it will be another tool to add to the arsenal, right? That can be used alongside solar power, wind power, hydropower, geothermal, nuclear power, nuclear fusion research. And China's leading in literally all of those areas. But as I say, I don't think this is going to be a game changer. I think it's going to be one of many techniques that we can use to transition away from burning fossil fuels.
And we'll see Meta wanting to buy this very soon, and they will be incorporated in Singapore or who knows, Cayman Islands.
Well, I think if Meta bought it or any sort of Western company bought it, they would buy it to kill it, right? Because if this did go into wider use, then our like oil dependency, fossil fuel dependency would be over. I mean, obviously this is very, like you're saying, in the very first stages. So that's how they would see it. They would see that. And I mean, because we can already see the Western media framing China's green technology as a threat to national security. And I'm going to pull up this other tweet that you did here, Carlos. You know, it's let's unpack this because it's very interesting how they recycle their propaganda points, but it's always right, but at what cost? But in this case, they're going further. They're suggesting China's green technology that might actually be saving the planet, that could potentially save the planet, let's face it, but at what cost to our national security? So, Carlos, can you unpack this for us?
Sure. I mean, as we've just been discussing, China dominates every area of renewable energy and green technology in general. Like China is by far it's the only renewable energy superpower. It leads the world in wind power, in solar power, in nuclear power, in battery technology, in production of electric vehicles, in electric transport. You know, 2/3 of the world's high-speed rail is in China. China manufactures, I think it's like 98% of all electric buses in the world. Something like 70% of China's buses now are fully electric. You've got a number of big cities, including Shenzhen, which are 100% electric bus. They're leading in biodiversity protection. They're leading in afforestation, you know, in forest development, in terms of sustainable water management, in terms of reversing desertification. So China's providing technological and scientific leadership through its sustained state investment and its industrial policy in every area, right? So China's really the indispensable power in all things green. And Inga Anderson, who's the executive director of the UN Environment Programme, actually this week gave what she called a big shout out to China's environmental leadership, right? So essentially, if it weren't for China, then humanity's shared project of avoiding climate catastrophe is in a pretty disastrous state, right? So everyone should be kind of thanking China for what it's been doing. And this gap between China and Europe and the US, it's widening, you know. China's getting advantages of scale. It's got supply chain integration. It's got a pace of innovation. All of these things favor China. And Western, like our green industries in the West, are heavily dependent on Chinese inputs, on rare earths, on solar panels, on processed materials, on components, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got this contradiction that, you know, we want to avoid climate breakdown, and actually the world needs Europe to avoid, you know, to do what it can on renewable energy. The world needs the Americas to do what they can on renewable energy and preventing climate breakdown, because actually China can't solve this problem by itself. Thankfully, the countries of Latin America, the countries of Southeast Asia, the countries of Central Asia, Russia, the countries of Africa, Caribbean, the Pacific, they're all happily benefiting from China's innovations in renewable energy. And because of China's innovations and its economies of scale, the cost of renewable energy, solar and wind power, has reduced by between 85 and 90% in the last 10 to 15 years, right? So that's been a game changer. Nearly anywhere in the world now, if you're building a power station, it's cheaper to do so on the basis of renewable energy than it is to do so on the basis of fossil fuel. So that's a game changer. And that's almost exclusively thanks to China. The global south is taking advantage of that, but Europe refuses to do so. The US refuses to do so. And they're doing it on these extremely spurious national security grounds, right? And really, it's just protectionism dressed up in this national security language. It's not an exclusively Trump thing. It's not an exclusively Starmer thing. It's not an exclusively Merz or Macron thing, because the Biden administration was doing this, the Sunak administration was doing this, the Boris Johnson administration was doing this, introducing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, introducing tariffs on Chinese solar panels, and including sanctioning them, et cetera, And there's something hugely revealing that was said in that Financial Times article. Some or other analysts said that an underappreciated risk is that the US could demand Europe remove Chinese technology from its energy systems, or face tariffs, sanctions, or reduce security commitments from the US. So essentially, you've got Washington mandating the energy policy of Britain and of the European Union under threat of imposing sanctions, imposing tariffs, taking away their security umbrella, et cetera. So the US is essentially demanding that Europe shoot itself in the foot, that it pay way more for its green transition, or that it stop its green transition. And that's purely in Washington's interest. The new Cold War against China, the campaign of encirclement and containment of China, that's part of the project for a new American century. That's not part of the project for a new European century or a new British century. This is about the State Department and the Pentagon and the US playing on the global chessboard in a desperate and ultimately it's going to be unsuccessful attempt to preserve their hegemony and to suppress China's rise. It's not going to work, but they're the only ones who've got any interest in it working. But they're willing to use whatever leverage they can to prevent Europe from doing ordinary business with China to the benefit of European people and for the progress of the European economies. I mean, it's a really crazy situation.
In your opinion, what is the rationale, if there is any, for Europeans shooting themselves on the feet again and again? And now with the Strait of Hormuz closed, the global south rising, do you think things are changing?
I think
just before we get into the Strait of Hormuz, sorry, just to add on to that that question, just to clarify, you're saying that the national security threat that China is posing to Europe is that the US might actually do something to Europe because of China, one. And then two, just sort of like adding to Sarah's question is like, one, what is the actual national security threat from China in this regard? It's just a dependency on China. Is that it? And then is there a shift? Is there a pathway out of this quagmire? And then I guess we can go into the Strait of Hormuz because it's an entirely similar dynamic too.
Sure. I mean, the reason that's being put forward, the putative security issue with Europe, is that China could, if China's supplying low carbon technology, low carbon components to Europe, then they could in the future restrict that supply. And we heard this with the supply of Chinese electric buses to London. London has actually quite a lot of electric buses now, and they're produced in China. And that's you would think that's an excellent thing, but you have got these China hawks saying, well, what if Xi Jinping decides to bring London to a standstill by using some kind of Easter egg code hack in the software that sells these buses, right? So, I mean, the essential thing is obviously, if you're using technology that's sourced in another country, potentially that country has the ability to interfere with it in some way. There's no doubt about it. But the question is, why would China do that? China's into doing business. China's into mutually beneficial cooperation. China would have absolutely no reason whatsoever to restrict its supply of low carbon technology. China profits from its supply of low carbon technology. China's devoted decades and unbelievable resources into being able to provide low carbon technology at a very competitive cost. So why would it harm its own interest? There's only one possible context where it would choose to do that, which is if Europe went to war against it, essentially, or if Europe participated in a US-led aggression against it. So Europe has to ask itself, do we want to go to war against China? Would that ever, under any reasonable scenario, be a sensible thing to do? And I'm fairly sure the answer, if we think about it hard enough, is no. But the US might force us to, and that's another question altogether. So, there's a real question for Europe, and it's an open question. What is more important to us? Do we want to participate in this US-led new Cold War, which is going nowhere? Or do we want to prevent climate catastrophe and build our economies? And sorry, you can't have both.
Very true. Moving on to, I think, a little bit more of Sarah's question on the Strait of Hormuz. Do you want to develop that a little bit more, Sarah?
No, I think the question was, it's very difficult to understand the rationale, if there is any, that Europeans keep shooting their foot again and again and again and again. It's it's difficult to understand. And now with the Strait of Hormuz and latest development, we had the Emirates coming out of the English, I don't know the word, OPEP. So now they can sell oil as they want, for the price they want. And I think we are seeing the crisis of the petrodollar as well, because the petrodollar was set up in the context that US would give security against security for the stability of those Gulf dictatorships against their own people. And guess what? The first attempt to bomb, they already fled like rats. So we are seeing a huge, super secure to have a military US base there. There is a lot of mythology collapsing here. We see the trouble with the dollar swaps raising. It is a symptom of the decline of the US. My question was more in this context, why the Europeans are still in this Cold War against China. They are, they at the same time, we see a little bit of approximations there. So it would be your analysis on where the winds are blowing here.
Well, I think Europe is to some degree addicted to this Cold War framework, right? From 1945 in particular, and the start of the Cold War, which formally kicks off, I suppose, with Winston Churchill's Fulton speech in 1946, where Europe and North America went from being wartime allies with the Soviet Union to being implacable and long-term opponents of the Soviet Union and the Eastern and Central European people's democracies. So, it turned into a East versus West scenario, in which scenario the US was clearly in the lead of the Western camp, right? Because the US was a rising and ascendant capitalist power. It had had a very good Second World War. Germany was destroyed. Britain had suffered very badly. France was destroyed. So all the big powers of Europe had suffered very badly in the Second World War. The United States did great. They lost hardly any people, and they made lots of money, sometimes through selling weapons to both sides. There were a lot of US businesses that continued to sell weaponry and various types of equipment to the Nazis throughout World War II, including when the US entered the war. So US emerged as a superpower, essentially. It was the superpower of the Western side of the Cold War, and European countries really had no choice but to fit under its military, economic, and political umbrella to fight a protracted and asymmetric warfare against the Soviet Union, against the People's Republic of China, and against their allies in the socialist world. And even though really and truly that should have come to an end in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Soviet Union on the 31st of December 1991. And yet, there's kind of some kind of ideological addiction. I mean, in the British case, the British ruling class suffers from a very severe case of empire nostalgia. The British Empire doesn't meaningfully exist anymore, other than in Diego Garcia, other than in the Las Malvinas, the so-called Falkland Islands, and a couple of islands, the Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific, and things like that. And of course, not forgetting the occupied 6 counties of Northern Ireland. But the British Empire is not really and truly a going concern anymore. But we really miss the British Empire, and the British ruling class came to understand quite a long time ago that the only way to maintain some semblance of empire would be to hang on to US coattails and basically to subsume our imperial project into the US's imperial project. And that's a big part of the motivation for Brexit, is to get closer, even closer, develop ever more and more the so-called special relationship between the US and Britain. Although what's funny is that the US increasingly doesn't particularly care about this special relationship. And you even had Britain's new ambassador to the US remark in private, off the record comments a couple of months ago, but the news has just come out this week, which is that he said, oh, the US and Britain don't have a special relationship anymore. In as much as the US has a special relation with any country, it's Israel, which is hilarious, right? As for Europe, I think, as for the European Union, the Germans and the French often make some noise about strategic autonomy and about breaking out of the US umbrella. And there is some trajectory towards that, and there are some historic milestones, the most important and obvious one being that France and Germany refused to participate in the 2003 war in Iraq. And then those countries, the major countries of Western Europe and Britain signed up for the China-led Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank back in 2016, 2017, against the very strong recommendation of Washington. So, there's an overall trajectory towards Europe asserting its independence, asserting its sovereignty, but there's also a lot of historical ties and economic ties, and cultural ties that keep these countries more or less in the US camp. And a big part of it is the dollar system, is the Wall Street, is dollar hegemony, which means that the US has a huge amount of economic leverage. The US could, if they wanted to, collapse more or less any European economy by snapping their fingers, right? Sorry.
How so?
Because, well, it's a complicated thing that I'm not really very well prepared to answer. But if countries do so much of their trade in dollars,
of course,
and if they hold so much of their reserves in US treasuries, then that gives the US a lot of leverage that it can use. And you can see, I mean, Trump is the most flagrant about this than any president in probably US history, that he just says, oh, if you do something we don't like, we're going to put tariffs on you, right? So we're going to essentially cut you out of the US market. Obviously, that's damaging for the US, but it's more damaging for the people that he's putting tariffs on. except in the case of China, which is a special case. So, Europe is pulled in different directions. I think I'm optimistic in the sense that I think that there is a trajectory for Europe to shift out of the US umbrella and fight towards finding its place in a multipolar world. And the fact that European leaders are going to Beijing all the time, and that Pedro Sanchez has been to Beijing 4 times in 4 years, and that Keir Starmer, for as hopeless and feckless as I consider him to be, was the first British Prime Minister in 8 years to visit China, which he did a few months ago. The Friedrich Merz has been to China. The Macron has been to China multiple times, and that they're trying to develop some sensible and independent trading and investment relationship with China. These are all positive things. I think increasingly people recognize, especially in a context where a declining US neoliberal imperialism is acting in, frankly, slightly insane ways, with no regard whatsoever for international law, with no regard whatsoever for basic norms of relations between states, with no regard whatsoever for the United Nations Charter, to a point where they can threaten to invade Greenland, or they can kidnap the president, the elected president of a state, i.e. Venezuela, to the point where they can wage war against Iran on the basis that they say that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. And in spite of the fact that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons and has literally got a religious edict in place against the development of nuclear weapons, and B, the countries doing the attacking, i.e. the United States and Israel, are both nuclear weapons powers. So the US is acting in such a flagrantly aggressive and criminal way. It's taken the mask off to such a degree. It no longer talks about human rights. It no longer excuses its behavior on the basis of democracy or freedom of speech, or even, fighting the godless communists or whatever they used to talk about back in the days of Vietnam, back in the days of Afghanistan. What they talk about now is, we're going to take control of Venezuela's oil. We're going to control energy flows out of the Strait of Hormuz and out of the Red Sea. They're flagrant about it now. And so with the US being so increasingly unpredictable and being itself a declining power, I think there's a lot of motivation for the countries of Europe and for other countries in what the Chinese theorize as the intermediate zone. So basically the lesser imperialist powers. And that includes Europe, but it also includes Canada, it includes Australia, it includes South Korea, it includes Japan. Those all have motivation. They would all have a sensible rationale to move closer to China and away from US hegemony. And that's a process that's in the works, but it's clearly going to be a historic process, and a process probably of generations.
God, the devil bless Trump, such a divisive figure. I was just thinking about what you're saying about the Europeans. Trump managed not only to divide MAGA from within, but he also managed to divide the European ultra-right and right. If you say Friedrich Merz and the AfD, the Nazi party in Germany, saying, oh, don't get associated with Trump in times of election because you won't win. And then you have Merz against Orban. Well done, Trump. You are helping us in a way.
It's like, the imperial agenda or strategy of divide and conquer, but they're just doing it to themselves. So we'll just watch them do it to themselves. But in terms of still talking about Iran and this is going to be like a little bit of a 2-part question, because I know we have to let you go soon. But basically, what we hear about a lot, and you just tweeted this, is when it comes to Iran, China's somewhat attacked from both sides, right? Like they're either being accused of not doing anything, or we also hear the other frustration, which is more well-meaning, I think, that they're not doing anything, or the other one that it's not well-meaning, but I find it like comforting that they are actually, in fact, doing a lot. And so Australian Strategy Policy Institute report entitled "Helping Iran, China is a Party in the War." Now, I think this is another attempt, because the Iran war is going so badly, it seems. And again, can you give us a little bit of a status of that, especially the Strait of Hormuz situation? Because I'm hearing from both sides that both sides are blocking boats, and boats are coming through, and I'm very confused about what's actually happening in that regard. But regardless, really, it is going badly for everyone else in the world. And so ASPI is basically trying to claim that it is China's fault, because it's, China's the one that is like, I don't know, providing Iran with all sorts of technologies to fight this war. Can you help us break that down?
Yeah, I feel like you've asked me a few questions there.
Yes, I did.
I mean, on the broader question of the situation in Iran, I think the basic situation is that Iran has won the war so far, right? You had 40 days of outright aggression that caused terrible damage, 3,500 civilian casualties, damage to civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals. We talked about the Minab primary school, where 168 young schoolgirls were killed. Apartment buildings have been targeted, oil depots have been targeted, bridges, ports. It's like a litany of war crimes. And Minab, I think, will go down in history as the worst war crime that's been committed since the Vietnam War, right? But it failed in its objectives. It was supposed to be a decapitation strike. They were going to take out Said Ali Khamenei. They were going to take out Ali Larijani. They were going to take out, the top military and political and religious leaders. And then that was going to stimulate some kind of internal uprising, and they would be in a position to essentially run Iran. That's clearly been unsuccessful. Iranians are more united than they've ever been. We're seeing, even now, right, 2 months in, millions of Iranians coming out into the streets every night, making it clear that they defend their country, they defend their sovereignty, they defend their government, they defend their leadership, they defend their constitution. They defend the right of the Islamic Republic of Iran to exist in whatever form the Iranian people want, right? And the Iranians, meanwhile, have inflicted this enormous damage on Israel and on US military and economic assets in the region, in the Persian Gulf. It's been reported that around half of all US missile and interceptor supplies have been used up already, right? That's a new report that's come out from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that the US forces have used up 45% of their precision strike missiles, more than half of their THAAD interceptors, 30% of their Tomahawk cruise missiles. And, and the Pentagon has announced that the US has spent $25 billion so far on this war. And if the Pentagon's saying it, you know it's going to be at least 10 times that, okay? But 25 billion itself is a large number, and it takes all of these missiles, all of these anti-missile defenses. They take a long time to replenish those. You can't just snap your fingers or make an order with McDonnell Douglas and Boeing and say we want more of these. We're talking about years to replace those. To replace that military capacity. Iran, meanwhile, has still got thousands of medium and short-range ballistic missiles, and it's got the capacity to replenish its missile supplies and its drone stockpiles very, very rapidly. And it's been doing that this whole time, this whole break since the initial ceasefire was announced 3 weeks ago. Iran has been continuing its weapons production. So, meanwhile, military bases in the Gulf have been wiped out. Like the US's capacity for power projection in that region has gone from 100% to probably 10%. Even Merz, even Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, has said that the United States has been humiliated by Iran, which is hilarious, right? Control of the Strait of Hormuz has sent the global economy into a tailspin. Oil prices have just now hit $120 a barrel. They were about $65 or $70 a barrel before the start of the war on 28th of February. The International Energy Agency are saying that this is the biggest energy crisis in history. All Western countries are looking at zero growth or negative growth for the foreseeable future, right? Energy prices are going up. That's going to drive inflation up. That's going to drive the cost of borrowing up. That's going to drive economic activity down. You know, factories are going to close down, services are going to close down, shops are going to close down. So we got a recession looming. And meanwhile, these US allies in the Persian Gulf, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, etc., so the Bahrainis, the US has treated them as a cash cow for decades. Their role in life is to produce oil, produce gas, get paid lots of money, and spend that money on two things: the US stock market and the US military-industrial complex, buying obscene, weapons of mass destruction that they've got absolutely no use for whatsoever. That money is drying up, right? Energy production is way down in the region. The ability to export energy is way down in the region. So how's that going to affect the US and the Western economy in general when you have all of that money taken out of US treasuries, when you have all of that money taken out of the US stock market, when you have all of that money taken out of the US military-industrial complex? So the result is that we've got this very fragile ceasefire, and we could talk about this for hours. I think things could essentially go in two different directions. There's two possible outcomes for the moment. The first and the best is that the United States finds its off-ramp, which the dimensions of which basically will be some kind of nuclear deal along the lines of the JCPOA, but much more favorable to Iran, with the lifting of sanctions, with long-term security guarantees, with the world accepting Iran's long-term control of the Strait of Hormuz, which it can use for leverage. That's the best security guarantee it's going to have, actually. And this is essentially what we're describing is a massive victory for Iran. But if Trump can find some way to present that as a victory, that's great, right? That's the best possible outcome. The other outcome is we return to war, possibly with a ground invasion. The US has been transporting thousands of troops to the region. It's increasing its naval presence. And if there's a return to war, well, Iran is very, very ready to continue fighting that war. It's very ready to continue punishing Israel. It's very ready to continue punishing US assets in the Gulf. The Yemenis may very well close the Bab al-Mandab, which means closing off access to the Red Sea, which would make the energy flow crisis an awful lot worse, which would make the global economic crisis an awful lot worse. Iran's got weaponry that hasn't even been used yet, including longer range ballistic missiles and drones. You've got literally millions, probably a third of the Iranian adult population is under arms and is signed up, is registered as volunteers to fight for their country in case of a ground invasion. So any ground invasion would be completely disastrous for the US. It would be an absolute quagmire. It would be, without question, the worst and the most humiliating defeat for the United States since Vietnam. So if they want to do that, well, they can do that. But those are the two directions it could go. As for China's role and this ASPI report, I think, first of all, it's important to remember the nature of ASPI. ASPI is not some kind of independent think tank. It's funded by the US government. It's funded by the Australian government. It's got close ties to the military and intelligence communities. It's got a whole history of producing these types of reports that align very closely with Western geopolitical interests. It gets funding from Boeing. It gets funding from McDonnell Douglas. It's part of it. It's like a public relations arm of the military-industrial complex, and people will be familiar with the reports that it's done in relation to Xinjiang. ASPI, along with this random German character who works for the Victims of Communism Memorial Committee, or whatever it's called. Those are the two leading arms of slandering China in relation to supposed human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And the report is just saying, it's just a way of saying China is our enemy, right? They're just building support for anti-China measures. They're just justifying US military posture in the Pacific and framing China as a belligerent. And basically, it should just be disregarded. And what are its substantive accusations? It's that China is supplying dual-use technology to Iran. That's technology that can be used for civilian purposes, but also with potential military applications. This is a common accusation that's used to justify sanctions and restrictions on China. Basically includes everything from semiconductors to artificial intelligence to manufacturing equipment. You know, it's just a complaint that really it's a complaint that China doesn't join in with the West's illegal sanctions and embargo against Iran. What is the reality of China's support for Iran? I mean, you know, it's definitely the case that China's baseline position is that it supports Iran. It's clear, it's open about that. I was just in China, actually. I spoke to many academics, many journalists, many ordinary people. There's a huge amount of sympathy with and support for Iran. And there's, you know, consensus hostility towards the US's position and to this US-Israeli criminal war, right? And you can speak to Iranians with knowledge of these matters as well. It's clear that China is doing a lot for Iran. It's clear that Russia is doing a lot for Iran. And most of it isn't in the public domain, and we can't actually know about it. And there's not much point speculating about it. But there's a lot going on. And the fact that Iran very consistently shows its appreciation to China and shows its appreciation to Russia indicates that, you know, the relationship is good and those countries are helping out to the extent that they can. And in China's case, they've got a very good reason to do so, because I think China recognizes quite clearly that this war in Iran is ultimately a part of the US grand strategy of containing China and of suppressing China's rise that we've been talking about. You know, Iran has very strong economic relations with China, including energy imports, including infrastructure projects, including technology cooperation. Iran is central to the Belt and Road Initiative. It's geopolitically, strategically crucial in terms of access to West Asia, in terms of access to the Mediterranean. If you think about the map, where Iran sits between, you know, the Persian Gulf and West Asian region in general, and Europe on one side, and East Asia and South Asia on the other, Iran is extremely important. The US is trying to get control of energy flows, you know, not only from Iran, but from the wider region, from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, from the UAE, from Qatar, from Kuwait, etc. And that control could be decisive in the case of a hot war against China, right? So China recognizes that it has got some skin in this particular game, right? And diplomatically and economically, I think it's doing what it can for Iran. China came out with its 4-point proposal for peaceful resolution. It's been working very closely with Pakistan to encourage that effort at mediation. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, has had 30 calls and meetings with his counterparts, trying to seek, work towards a lasting ceasefire. The Chinese special envoy, Jai Jun, toured the Gulf and Arab capitals, trying to, develop some kind of negotiation process. China's consistently, from the beginning, denounced the US and Israeli illegal aggression in every international forum. They've denounced this new US supposed blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. They've been standing up for Iran's sovereignty. Very importantly, a couple of weeks ago, they blocked this Bahrain-introduced resolution of the United Nations Security Council, which essentially would have set up the possibility, or like a legal foundation for a ground invasion of Iran. And China and Russia blocked that. China's continued its legitimate economic relations with Iran. It's refused to endorse the unilateral sanctions. And more directly and militarily, obviously, China's not in a position to send troops to fight the US in Iran. But lots has come out about intelligence sharing. Iranians are using Chinese geolocation systems. There's indications that Iran's been using Chinese satellite technology as well. So there's a lot going on in terms of Chinese support for Iran. Some of it is in the public domain, some of it's not in the public domain, but that's very much China's baseline position. China supports Iran, China supports international law, China supports the principle of sovereign equality, and so China's doing what it can. And meanwhile, as we've talked about on this show before, I think in the last live stream that we did together, Iran actually militarily doesn't need that much support. Iran's doing a very good job. Iran's giving an excellent account of itself, and the rest of the world should be thankful that it is giving this massive bloody nose to the US empire and to the Zionist entity that it is.
And you know what, when we were talking like privately about this last week, I was thinking, why on earth China would not support Iran? The question is already wrong. The US is making proxy wars, using Latin America as a battleground against China. This is an attack on China. And by the way, why do I want to side with this unprecedented kleptocracy of the Epstein class that is waging war, plundering the entire world, plundering the resources of the planet? Of course, we all should stand with Iran. Of course, we should all help Iran. And by the way, Carlos, you were talking about the cash cow that the cash cow that the go fast. It remind me of a Bernie Sanders. Okay, Bernie Sanders, but still Bernie Sanders Twitter, and I found it here. The Trump family has made $4 billion off the presidency and the wars. They are waging those wars for a very good reason. So crypto, they made $3 billion. Oh, what a surprise! Persian Gulf deals, 455.8 million. Qatari jet, 150 million. And there you go. And there is more and more and more. That's how they are making their money, sitting there and plundering the entire planet on the cost of human lives.
Well, it's not going to last much longer, so don't worry. There's a brighter future ahead.
Good.
Don't worry about them, though. They have enough money. They'll be fine. Just in case anyone was worried. Thank you so much, Carlos, for coming on to this show again. And we will hopefully, I say hopefully, but I'm just going to say right now and make the announcement, we will see you again in about a month's time. So thank you, Carlos.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you so much, Carlitos. Bye.
Okay, well, now we are going to go on to your watch, which I'm excited about, but I have to figure out how to position us. Oops, no.
Oh, that's a new one. That is cool.
Yeah, that's a new one. That's a very weird one.
Yeah, I think if you could pull those two pictures and while I'm talking, it'll be very interesting. So, Ileana, this is we are talking about MI5 being involved on the training of the military in Brazil during the dictatorship. So we are talking about these people being accomplice on torture and murder, MI5 being accomplice to that. So for those who don't know much about the Brazilian military dictatorship, I was born in it. I was 7 years old when it stopped. And so it is a block of dictatorships that scarred Latin America. It can feel distant. It can feel like an abstract terror. But for many, many families in Brazil and across the continent, this horror has a name, has a date, has an empty chair at the table, has not knowing what happened to this beloved person. And Brazil's particular brand of this nightmare began in 64 with a coup d'etat that overthrew the president Jango. Jango was not a communist. He had a strategic alliance with the communists. He's actually a bourgeois nationalist, and we had 2 decades that follow of authoritarian rule. But the regime true face of horror emerged in 68, which is called the Institutional Act number 5. This act suspended all rights of habeas corpus, shut down the Congress, granted the president dictatorial powers, and that's when the repression began to be absolutely ruthless and brutal. And backed by the CIA Cold War crusade against the leftist movement across Latin America, the Brazilian state built a very elaborate machine of kidnapping, torture, and execution. And we are talking about people at their 20s, Ileana. So thousands were arrested, hundreds were killed, and to this date, we have over 200 Brazilians officially listed as disappeared. But we don't have, I was talking to my sister who studies this, we don't have any account of indigenous people, workers, and in rural areas. So this list is much, much bigger. Yeah. It was also a class war in a way. And one of those was Carlos Alberto Soares de Freitas. He was known as Beto he was a close friend of my parents. And until this investigation that was launched a few days ago, no one knew what happened to Beto. Actually, we didn't. I grew up hearing stories. Beto was one of those stories, and we did not know what happened to him. And now we have this report revealing that British intelligence taught Brazilians dictatorship techniques to build the most infamous killing center, the House of Death. And that's where Beto died. Beto was the first one to die that, according to this report. We knew so far the United States, the CIA supported the coup and helped the coup. President Lyndon Johnson's administration openly backed the military plotters, and the CIA, there was a telegram in 1964 where they fully confirmed their involvement. And we have now these two bombastic articles. They appeared in the press a few days ago. It's about British intelligence, how British intelligence helped to build the House of Death. So we have three reporters from ECL News, Juliana Dalpiva, Chico Otávio, Igor Melo. They unravel one of those great mysteries of the years of lead of the dictatorship, and they uncovered a direct connection between the dictatorship repressive apparatus and the British Intelligence Service. I'm saying here MI5 and BIS. So the report was based on a illegal archive from one of the most infamous colonels, Colonel Ciro Echegoyen. His code name was Bruno. He was one of the heads of the Brazilian Army Intelligence Center, and from 71 to 74. So this archive contained 23 folders, 3,000 pages of secret documents, and this colonel, he reviewed the connection of what they call Tigrada. Tigrada was the gang, a tiger group within the Brazilian intelligence services. They were known for their ruthless brutality and hardline instancy within the repression apparatus. And nobody else, not nobody else, but especially them, there was a clear connection with the British intelligence service. So how does it work? So the British helped to build the so-called House of Death close to Rio de Janeiro in a city called Petrópolis. They had this clandestine facility that operated there. And it was like a factory for creating what they called the dogs. So this was the name given to leftist militants who were captured and turned into double agents. And then they were reinserted into the resistance, and they would dismantle the existence and get more people and kill more people. And those who refused to cooperate, they were killed. So we know through this report that 22 people were murdered there. And only one person survived. Her name is Inés Etienne. She just died in 2015, and she described a few things. And she described that one of the doctors who would inspect dead bodies from torture said, "Your friend was there. So I've seen your friend there." That's all he said, to say that Beto died there. So far, people thought Beto was thrown into the Ocean with Stuart Angel, who was also a very famous militant. And it's very interesting because in this archive we see Brazilian officers as official guests of the British government, and the manual show torture methods by the British, teaching techniques like total isolation, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation in interrogations, extreme temperature changes, what they call the refrigerator, Spartan cells. There was an array, is a over 150-page document on how to torture someone without leaving marks. So this was an innovation. It's not about the physical torture, but about the psychological torture developed by the Brits. And so what we know through this document, that Batu specifically was shot in the head after interrogation because they were unsatisfied with his report. And why does this matter, Ileana? And not only Beto, if you see the ECL report, in the end, they have the names of other people that came out that were disappeared. The families don't know where they are until last week. What happened to them? Who knows where? Who knows how? And I think it's important because historical memory is a fundamental antidote against authoritarianism. It's a foundation for non-mythological, for a true sense of our collective identity, and sometimes because it isn't history. We saw Bolsonaro attempting a coup d'etat. We saw Trump attempting a coup d'etat. We are seeing the far right international rising. This ain't history in a way. And for most victims, I think is the only form of vindication. I wouldn't say justice, but vindication, having their names, their story told. And you see, for instance, Brazil jailed Bolsonaro, and I think one of the elements that contributes to it is that Dilma Rousseff put in place the Commission of Truth, and this Commission of Truth are people of all fields of knowledge starting digging out the story, the untold story of the Brazilian dictatorship. And this was extremely important for today. Brazil has, for the first time, 4 generals sitting in a cell along with the former president that attempted a coup d'etat. So the work of the Truth Commission, like unearthing state secrets and the repressive apparatus, in my view, is arguably one important reason why, for the first time, we have justice. The Brazilian military is alive well, it's always preparing coup d'etat. Flávio Bolsonaro and Eduardo Bolsonaro, sons of Jair Bolsonaro, are very close with Paulo Figueiredo, which is the grandson of a former dictator, who were in the US now plotting a coup against Brazil, delivering state secrets to Trump. So I think it's very important, lest we forget about this brave people that were prepared to give everything for my freedom, your freedom, to be here today and to be denouncing in Empire Watch what the empire is capable of. So it's very important.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's actually incredibly significant because this, as you pointed out in the very beginning, in the intro to your watch, this is about the Cold War that was happening, the anti-communist campaign, the US-led anti-communist campaign. 1964, this coup happened, and in 1965, a similar thing happened in Indonesia. We remember that was also part of the same Cold War anti-communist campaign. So we have to really, this is so important because I think for a lot of people, imperialism is very abstract. And that's why they'll say things like, oh, but Russia's imperialist, China's imperialist, this country's imperialist, that. And it's like, when you actually remember the victims, and again, like you said, this absolute psychological trauma of people just disappearing, you never hear from them again. What that does to the psyche of the population when there are a huge percentage, like a significant percentage of the population just disappeared because they have like communist or leftist socialist ideals, really ideals for a better country and a better world. that, we can't really underestimate the ongoing effects of that. And it is ongoing now because people do not understand what happened during that time because it was so effective. So I think it is so significant, Sarah, and it's so important because how many times have we tried to explain imperialism? I think when we explain it in this abstract way, and we try because part of Empire Watch is to try to explain how the system is currently working, how can we dismantle the mechanisms right now. But I think the human part is very hard to explain. The empathy that is required to understand the cost of continuing imperialism, that is just absolutely impossible to explain by words, So I think it's so important. So thank you for this, Sarah.
Yeah, and I have here also, you see, this is Inés. This is the woman who has survived. And this is Beto, and these are the other people who were Antonio, Mariano, Aloysio, Ivan, Eleni, Walter, Paulo. These were people that the family never knew. I got here a report, a testimony of one of Beto's friend. Her name is Oroslinda. She said, Beto was my companion of fight since 1966, in the guerrilla fights. We were in the fight before even the coup happened. He was a different person, combative, firm, and at the same time tender. And in a time that you are uninspired to be tender. He was happy, he was funny, loved to sing, with beautiful bleak blue eyes. And she was saying, my heart, it's the first time that I see in a newspaper publishing something that explicitly talked about torture and his assassination and his death. My heart is bleeding.
Oh, yeah, that's beautiful and sad. And I do think of these people as revolutionary heroes, really martyrs for the cause, right? And how their legacy completely wiped out, over the decades. So thank you. Yeah, so important for us to keep highlighting these stories. So thank you for the watch.
You've cried once, now I'm crying.
I'm
cry me baby anyway. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's very moving.
And now we have your watch, which I think you should crack on. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully I can get it done. So I basically called it my monologue watch, Le Boubou Forced Labor.
What is the boo-boo? I mean, a lot of people aren't English, are English mother language. And every time you guys talk about acronyms, I get completely confused in the conversation. And all those fictitious names coming from English, can you explain to a non-English audience about Le Boubou?
Okay, I'm going to show you Le Boubou, all right? Because
it is... And show me your word play. I said it's a word of play or something like this. Yeah.
It's so Le Boubou is this craze. I guess you would call it a craze. I'm just going to share this tab so you can see what it looks like. It's like a craze that kind of has overtaken, I guess, the youth.
Oh, how cute is this?
Oh my gosh, you're one of them.
But so 20 euros is insane to pay 20 euros for it. What do they do?
Oh, it gets way more expensive than that. This is like a resale site. I think this is just a resale site. So it can get really much more expensive, but basically it's a collectible. You can put it on your purse. I mean, I don't get it personally. So I don't know.
Does this thing talk? Does the thing gives you company record for the CIA? I mean, why is 20 pounds, 20 euros for a little... It reminds me of Hello Kitty.
Yeah. It's essentially like the new troll or the new Hello Kitty. It just has absolutely taken over the world by storm. And it's
saying people don't buy. If you're watching this, don't buy. Sabotage. Yeah.
No more consumerism for no reason. Yeah. Okay, but having said that, this segment is in support of it. So it's a little bit contradictory what I'm going to say. Okay, so basically... Yeah. I do not believe in buying silly things like this. I think collecting these things are ridiculous. However, no judgment. You do you, whatever makes you happy. Okay, you do you. However, the funny thing about this is that because it's a Chinese company, Pop Mart, Of course, the US is using this to further their claims of forced labor, which, by the way, it's absolutely convoluted the way that they have come about to accuse Pop Mart and Labubu of this forced labor. It's a very typical propaganda point, though. So I'm going to go over it for once and for all. I mean, probably not for once and for all, but just again to bring to the forefront how flimsy the so-called evidence is of forced labor in Xinjiang. But just to sort of explain why we're talking about this now, when the first allegations of this forced labor and false labor claims in Xinjiang were actually in 2020. There are two incidents that just happened in the last 2 months. Basically, the first one that came to my attention, although I'm sure there are others, but the first one here is this this Canadian Liberal MP. So this Canadian Liberal MP, Michael Ma, was actually, he faced backlash after questioning a witness about reports of forced labor in China's Xinjiang region during a parliamentary committee hearing. And he was basically forced to apologize about a week ago for just questioning the narrative that there's forced labor in Xinjiang, which, by the way, has never, ever been proved. And the person he was questioning, she cited a Human Rights Watch, which is essentially, it's an NGO that is funded by the Ford Foundation. It's essentially a imperialist tool sort of NGO, you know? So it's not at all credible. And when you look at their reports on Xinjiang, they trot out the same exact propaganda people. There is a certain amount of propaganda people that you can now, you know, when it's connected to Xinjiang, that you can actually just pretty much know it's BS. Sorry for the language. And actually, Carlos already mentioned them, and Adrian Zenz and Aspie. You know, he mentioned them in his segment. So I'm gonna go over a little bit more here. So basically here, before I get to that, Canadian Liberal MP, you know, he faced backlash. He had to apologize, and then we had this article from the New York Times, which I actually can't bring up because it's paywalled. But the New York Times reported that independent testing of Labubu dolls bought in the US found that 16 of the 20 tested contained cotton whose isotopic signature links it directly to farms in Xinjiang. Under US law, products containing Xinjiang-linked inputs fall under the scope of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Therefore, the findings could trigger enforcement by US Customs and Border Protection. So they're trying to get the Labubu banned in the US, essentially.
Yeah, very interesting. Sorry to just bring this in, but what about the batteries made with cobalt, with child mining labor work, certified labor work? You know, Amnesty International has done a thorough investigation in that one. So I think they should ban Apple. It's very interesting how they use law to selective destroy enemies. Yeah.
Things that are actually proven, and we've seen actual footage, pictures, and statistics, and all the evidence backed, that's fine. But this Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was passed in 2021, no evidence to even suggest that there is forced labor in Xinjiang. And by the way, it's only talking about Uyghur, so it doesn't even make sense. Like, it is an ethnically enforced, you know, Prevention Act. It actually creates a rebuttable presumption, which means that if a product is made wholly or partly in Xinjiang, or by an entity on this entity list, it is automatically assumed to be made with forced labor. You don't even have to investigate it. And the importer can challenge that presumption, but the burden of proof is completely on the importer. So the importer is required to prove a negative, to demonstrate that forced labor did not occur anywhere in their supply chain. So because the law starts with this assumption of guilt, again, based on no evidence at all, it's going to be impossible to therefore mount a
I
different.
mean, yeah, it makes sense that the importer has a burden of proof, yeah, or the producer. The problem is the application of this legislation, which is absolutely selective. And you know what, Ileana, I don't know how we can call the US a democracy, because legislation are made to selectively destroy people, not to grant rights at times. And let's not go too far, but a little bit further. This is here, you say, this is a book, The War Against the Panthers, and that's exactly what the FBI did. The FBI had a counter-terrorist intelligence agents who were really concerned about the Black Panthers' free breakfast. So they started to say that there were poison in the food of the Black Panthers to dismantle the movement. This, the whole war against the Black Panthers, it's maybe the manual book of what we are seeing today. That's why I'm finding this book extremely important, because those are the techniques. It began before, but I think it's incredible the ruthless application in the war against the revolutionary America, and especially against the Black America. And I think all those techniques that sounds to us maybe as conspiratory, they were reported, they were documented. That's how they enforce legislation, And yeah, so the Black Panthers free breakfast was a huge success. So therefore, there were poison on it. So they even hired third parties to say there were poison on it. So it's strikingly similar, isn't it?
Yeah, and also to remember too that the Black Panthers were Marxist-Leninists, and it was again the Cold War that we were talking about. It's entirely part of the whole Cold War paradigm, and it was more about, it was under COINTELPRO, right? So essentially, it was an anti-communist campaign domestically in the US that targeted the Black Panthers because they were Marxist-Leninists. So
yeah,
again,
they call themselves actually revolutionary intercommunalists. They had their own, because they believe they need to do things within they are international, but they are intercommunalists. This is extremely interesting. Well, how America hates people, how America hates their own citizens.
Yeah, and how scared they are of socialism. I mean, they're extremely scared of any sort of revolutionary force, and they have gotten rid of every revolutionary force in their country, essentially. And now they're trying to do the same in China. So, but to get back to this, the idea is essentially another sanction against China. That's what they're trying to do here. But because nobody really looks at what the claims are, I'm going to actually go into it so we can see how flimsy it is. Because on further examination, all this so-called evidence for the forced labor are US state-backed propaganda sources. And they actually, even within the sources, because I looked it up, as tedious as it is, I looked up the document that they're referring to, and none of them can make the case for forced labor. They bend the definitions of forced labor in a way that makes them think, that it makes it seem like if you're not able to really read that well, then you might come away with the conclusion of, oh, they're being forced to do things, therefore it's forced labor, or, and the fact is, forced labor has a very specific legal definition, right? Like it means something very specific. And even without that legal definition, they're not even getting, okay, but I'll get into it a little bit more to explain how. But first, let me just talk about the US-backed propaganda sources that we need to sort of point out, even in the New York Times article. So the New York Times article, the initial Times investigation, which happened in 2025, began with an anonymous tip sent by Campaign for Uyghurs. This is in 2025. Campaign for Uyghurs is a Washington-based advocacy NGO, non-government organization, aligned with the World Uyghur Congress. World Uyghur Congress is one of the most famous national endowment democracies propaganda front, and also the Campaign for Uyghurs themselves received a democracy award from the National Endowment for Democracy in 2025. You know, and if people don't know what
we had Corina Machado receive the Nobel Prize, and Trump said, "I deserve it." So wow, those prize means a lot. Obama, war criminal. Kissinger, maybe the huge war criminal of all times, got a Nobel Prize. So I mean, I think this must be an amazing prize to get. You know what? I am very afraid of people who go get those prizes, but I think people who will land in the FBI or CIA files, those are good.
Yeah, you have to also remember that the National Endowment of Democracy is specifically an extension of the CIA. It was founded at a time when they were saying, like, you know what, CIA has been getting a bad rap. So we're going to found an organization, National Endowment for Democracy, that will do what the CIA used to do, but more publicly. It's allowed to publicly exist and say things like pro-democracy, but essentially it's connected very much to the CIA. So that's why it's like anything, any entity or person, you know, so there are several Nobel Prize winners, for example, that have gotten NED awards.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dalai Lama, Maria Ressa. Yeah. So this is like, once you know that they have gotten money from the NED, you know not to trust them. That's like a propaganda front for the CIA. And it works. You know, this type of propaganda in terms of repetition really works, because already as I said, the New York Times have reported this on the 23rd of April, right? So by the April 29th, the Lububu story had moved from the New York Times' supposed investigative journalism, which, by the way, all they did was find cotton from Xinjiang. That doesn't prove anything, but that the cotton's from Xinjiang, which is not a big deal, right? But from this, by April 29, it's all over the opinion ecosystem. Yahoo News, other outlets begin publishing op-eds that reframe the New York Times finding in this way, like found forced labor in the Lububus. You know what I mean? Like New York Times investigative.
Oh, you know, now I'm already thinking maybe I should get a Labubu.
Oh no.
My sister's birthday is coming. Maybe I should give her Labubu.
Well, you could definitely.
Birthday is coming. Maybe I should get her a Labubu, and then we put a stand with around little T-shirts on the Labubu, or Palestine T-shirts on the Labubu. I think it's kind of interesting now. The Labubu.
No, so now I have like created some sort of monster.
Oh, there is a cat around the corner. So cute. I'll put the name Labubu on the cat.
Yeah, so basically, again, so looking back onto this, you can buy the Labubu if you want. Okay, fine. I'm no longer against Labubu, but yeah. But so basically, it's being published. You know, yes, essentially, it is like a bit of a boycott to Labubu because of this false labor claim. Even so, they are repeating these op-eds, and I'm going to show you this really interesting one, because this one very firmly illustrates what these opinion pieces are. And I will show you again the usual suspects in this. Okay, so this is one that was published yesterday. What's inside the blind box? And this was initially published in The Hill, which, if you don't know, it used to pretend to be independent media, but it's really not. What's inside the blind box? Trendy toys on US shelves evade Uyghur labor laws. And the opinion piece is by Republican Chris Smith. He is a member of the House, what's it called? The US House. And Adrian Zenz. Now, Carlos already mentioned Adrian Zenz. He is a very famous figure in this Uyghur sort of false claims of genocide, etc. It really comes down to Adrian Zenz. He is like the most widely quoted, widely cited. In every report, you're most likely going to get some sort of reference to him in Western discourse on Xinjiang. And he is from the Victims of Communism and Memorial Foundation.
Oh.
Yeah. So again, straight up US propaganda. So to give people a sense of what this Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is, it is a US nonprofit in DC established by Congress in 1993 to build a national memorial and promote an anti-communist historical narrative. And so if you look at their website, they say like to commemorate victims of communist regimes and educate Americans about the ideology, history, and legacy of communism. And it was formally authorized by public law and signed by Bill Clinton.
Who is paying the shit? Who is paying the shit?
Well, I was trying to look for where the funding comes from, and all I could find was private funders.
Dalai Lama is an endowment as well, right? This smells like Dalai Lama BS.
I couldn't find links to National Endowment of Democracy. Dalai Lama, I could find direct links to CIA and funding from the State Department. This one seems to be private ones, but if we think about it, the people that founded it were also like right-wing conservative people, anti-communist people. So they have a reason, they're not hiding their agenda. Whoever's funding it, they are, like I said, it was authorized by public law. It was established by Congress in 1993.
This goes back to the thing that we are talking about history, about memory of history. I think if you ask any European school person who won against the Nazis, it was the communists. You fought with fellow communists to combat the Nazis. That's the story. This is a fact. Ask anyone that went to a British school, they will not concede that the communists fought the Nazi. The communists were their allies in Britain. Yeah. So, and then this BS is only possible because people don't study history. They study propaganda or obstruction of history or obscuring history. That's what they might be getting at school.
Exactly. And so, something like this, the Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation, you can see already, it's like, first of all, they want to obscure this Nazi thing. And they've actually, allegedly reported, deaths via communism. They also included Nazis in that, but they don't tell you. So, they inflate the numbers. A lot of communists died, not because of communism, but because of the forces they were fighting as well. You know what I mean? Like, so they're including the forces that were fighting Nazis as victims under communism, and then claiming that communism is such an evil force that it just kills all its own people. So it's a very like overtly propagandic anti-communist NGO here. And so this is, again, he's being recycled into this media ecosystem about forced labor claims. And if you think about how common these forced labor claims are, most likely you're going to hear from supposed leftists about forced labor in China. It is just a widely accepted fact in the Western world. Okay, so this is the danger of propaganda and repetition of propaganda. But sort of moving on a little bit here, because again, now we have the I guess in legal, I'm just going to pretend I'm a legal expert, but the fruit of the poison tree. It's like the fruit of the poison tree. So we know now this is it. This is their agenda. They're anti-communist. Adrian Zenz is the senior fellow and director of China studies in this anti-communist group, and then they are quoting from their own supposed study: forced labor, coercive land use transfers, and forced assimilation in Xinjiang's agricultural production. Again, this stuff is absolutely wild because
why China does not sue these people?
Well,
why do you think China doesn't sue them?
Because they would have to sue everybody. Like, first of all, we had that $1.6 billion anti-China act, under Biden that was passed. That was just one act, $1.6 billion just for anti-China propaganda. What they say, the terms that they use here, which is actually the terms that they use in the CIA documents as well, is to counter maligned Chinese influence or maligned communist influence, right? So they have so much funding for this purpose in so many different things, right? Like even if this one isn't funded directly by the State Department, they have private funding here. You have like the Tibetan funding, which, you know, in the CIA, they even showed that. In the State Department, they actually showed line by line millions and millions of dollars going to this Tibetan fund. That's just one outfit. That is just one, you know, the Tibetan fund to do with the Dalai Lama. So we think about if China was going to spend money and time and energy going after these people, it's literally like a snake with like, I don't know, 1 million heads, because there's, you know, there's not only that, there's also the Epoch Times, you know, the Falun Gong people that has like multiple media.
What court would decide upon it? It will be a US court granting a precedent for this future Nobel Prize winner, Adrian Zenz.
I mean, I just don't think that it would be worth the time. Like it would be a lawfare fight with the people that are designing the laws against you. And so China does try to sort of, they opened Xinjiang up. We can go see for ourselves. They allowed this UN investigator in 2020, the OHCHR report, which is where a lot of these things are cited from. They went there, they could not find evidence that, it's called the OHCHR Assessment of Human Rights Concerns in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. They opened up to these investigators. The investigators couldn't actually find any tangible evidence, but then they came, instead of saying we can't find any tangible evidence, we found no evidence, we can't prove our claims, they'll come away and say, we have concerns. You know, we couldn't prove it. We have concerns. And people who cannot read properly will just be like, oh, this proves that there are concerns. Well, what are concerns? You need proof to prove these things. Like you need evidence, and they just couldn't find it. But it's the same thing here. Like I think most people are not going to read this report, right? Like it's a pretty big report. I read through it. And frankly, it's absolutely ridiculous. First of all, this one, which they linked to from that opinion piece about cotton, is about tomatoes, red pepper, and paprika. It's not even about cotton, first of all. All right. But they link this as proof of the slave labor or forced labor practices in Xinjiang. And they actually quote the International Labor Organization standards, which are 11 specific standards, indications of forced labor, abuse of vulnerability, deception, restriction of movement, isolation, physical and sexual violence, intimidation and threats, retention of identity documents, withholding of wages, debt bondage, abusive working living conditions, and excessive overtime. And this is the definition for slavery, essentially. I mean, I used to volunteer at the Coalition to Abolish Slavery, and this is what we use to determine whether or not someone was being human trafficked. And this report that I put up here on the computer does not find these claims. What they're finding are, and this is the really hilarious part of it, is that essentially there's policies that are trying to help lift up the Uyghur people in that region, not just Uyghurs, but all that region is incredibly poor. Xinjiang was 70 to 80% desert. So it is an extremely poor area. They're trying to alleviate the poverty. It was one of the most poor areas in China. So to alleviate the poverty, there was like lots of different things that they did, including education, vocational training. And then this idea of the forced labor thing is just like, it's not forced labor by those 11 indicators. It was more that some people maybe didn't really want to work and they had to figure out what incentives to, help them either find jobs outside of the state, because at the time we were like really poor. So in order to raise the poverty level, there were opportunities outside of the state that they could go to. And Adrian Zenz and these people are saying that if you transfer out of state to get a job, that is a forced transfer, or like a transfer labor. Like they are suggesting that that is a genocidal transfer of people. But what they're doing is providing them jobs in other places where there are more jobs available, you know, including free training in these vocational centers. Also, they can choose the vocation that they want and get trained for it. And then they have a job lined up for them. So it's like, of course, it's not, it's not like, oh, the best thing, you know, it's not like, oh my God, it's like going to Disneyland. No, I mean, I think a lot of us maybe don't like to have jobs, but sometimes you need a job to you know, feed yourself, right? Like you need a job to, and then there's just other things in it. So basically they are saying, accusing China of forced labor because of the targeted poverty alleviation programs. They are looking at that as evidence of coercion, when the rest of us, I think the more logical of us, can look at the 100 million people that were lifted out of absolute poverty from 2013 to the end of 2020, which Xinjiang would be part of that, as an incredible feat for humanity. Because imagine if they did not, according to these people, any type of product that Xinjiang would make, anything that they would make, is now considered forced labor. So that means nobody in Xinjiang is allowed to have a job. They have a job. They are considered slaves that have been forced to work. You know, this is their mentality. There is no logic, you know, there's no logic applied if you think about it in terms of, you know. Do you have any questions about that though?
Yeah, no, I think just to wrap it up, I just received from Carlos now the latest I'm going to share with you guys the latest report from Friends of Socialist China. Very interesting here. And so we see here, you see the Chinese Society of Law, which I understand is a professional organization of legal experts. They issued a statement on April 25th. Now, they are condemning the use of military force by the United States and Israel. So, and the key points they make here is against, you know, the use of U.S. force in Venezuela. You know, U.S. launched a military strike, forcibly seizing the president, and the Chinese are calling this an illegal violation of the UN Charter. Yeah, then they go on to talk about the U.S. and Israel actions in Iran. Now, they describe this as an armed attack against the invasion of Iran that violates international law, humanitarian law, and they even say target civilian infrastructure, and they use as a legal basis the UN Charter, which is Article 2.4, prohibiting the use of threat and force against territorial integrity and political sovereignty of any country. And why this is so important, I would say it's very important because there is a recognition of US and Israel functional, what we call in law a functional partnership in crime. They are both liable under UN Charter of those crimes. I think it's very interesting that the rising power of the world, like China, is saying this alliance, you both have to respond for the violation of human rights, and you have to respond for violation of the UN Charter. I think it's very interesting because this is from legal experts as well. So there is these people, they have to abide by their legal ethics, you know, and they have the credibility to say so. Oh, well, this is something we all know. Yeah, but it's different when this comes from China and when this articulates as Israel and US alliance. I think it's a key piece of evidence on how China probably are legally watching and politically watching this conflict. And then you can say, do you think China will go in The Hague against both of them? Well, I think there is a threat, a political threat here That's the instance we take US. That's the instance we take Israel. And if you're going to escalate this, we're going to escalate as well. So very interesting, and just wanted to finish with that.
I haven't actually finished my watch, so I'm just going to finish it.
Oh,
but
sorry.
Yeah.
I thought we
But
finished.
just to add on to what you're saying, yes, I think this is very in line with China's use of international law. They've mentioned the UN Charter in almost every official speech that Xi Jinping has given. He's talked about international law. He's talked about the UN Charter and how we should adhere to it. And I really do think he's making the case, or China's making the case for why we shouldn't get rid of the UN Charter. We shouldn't get rid of international law.
Yeah.
We shouldn't get rid of the UN,
Yeah.
but we should actually use it in a way with integrity to hold the people accountable that we know are guilty, of genocide, of war crimes, of all these things. We can actually use the mechanisms that they designed to punish us, but we can use it against them in a way that's fair for everybody. So I do want to add on to that, because that's a really good point. And I think things are changing, like with the Meta block as well. But just to sort of end my watch, I did want to say that because this other thing that I'm hearing a lot about is, no, there's no evidence of forced labor in China. But not only that, over the last 20 years, China's wages have risen roughly tenfold. So this is one of the fastest increases in the world. Meanwhile, we look at the US, wages have risen by less than double. And this is the last 20 years, right? So last 20 years, the US wages have risen by less than double. UK wages have barely moved. And also China has closed much of the wage gap with Western economies through industrial upgrading, and also through stronger workers' protection. China also has the biggest trade union organization in the world. The All China Trade Union has 300 million people. And so people tend to think, oh, China has no unions, blah, blah, blah. No, that's not true. They have unions, but they're all unified into one huge power block. Imagine like 300 million people, when they come to negotiate, how much more power they have than splintering it off into tiny groups like we have in the West. And it's also important that this week too, 2 court cases were reported on very quietly that talked about in China that they ruled that AI automation cannot be used as a legal justification for firing workers. So tech companies must retain or transition employees before automating roles.
Wow.
And this is a landmark protection. So yeah, and because we're so scared of AI, right? We think AI is going to replace humans. China is not allowing it. They have had 2 court cases already that have ruled on this. And in contrast, let's just remind everyone, US tech companies have cut tens of thousands of jobs citing AI. Amazon eliminated about 30,000 roles. Microsoft shed roughly 8,750 workers. And, across all sectors, nearly 90 companies announced layoffs in early 2026, affecting 82,000 people. And AI was explicitly named in over 27,000 of those cuts. So I just want to sort of reiterate, today's May 1st, it's Labor Day, or as we're calling it, Workers' Day. And China is speaking for itself. It's showing the way forward, I think, for workers, like what can actually happen if we all sort of band together and have a socialist system, and they do not have forced labor. So I think it's a fitting one.
So I think we're past our time. Thank you
Yes.
for the contributions. I really like the chat. The chat was very interesting. Somebody was asking, who did the China present the document to? I understand this is an a open statement, and people were also remembering all about the works in diamond mine in Africa and the US, UK, Australia too. Yes, and yeah, we have a very knowledgeable audience here.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, everyone, for commenting, and thank you so much for watching. And we will see you next week, right? Thank you. Bye.